So now we've seen how shadowing affects our JavaScript variables. Now we'll learn about a concept called hoisting and how it can affect our JavaScript programs. Now we've seen variables are scoped to the function that they are declared in. Now this is to say JavaScript variables have what we call function scope. Let's take a look at a piece of example code. Here I have a function called doSomething, and it has a parameter doIt. In the first line of the function, we define a color variable with the value blue. Then we have an if statement, and based on the value of doIt, we then define var color equals red and console.log the value of color. Finally, after the if statement, and regardless of the value of doIt, we'll again call console.log, displaying the color after the if statement. Now you may be wondering if the var color inside of the if block is the same as the var color outside of the if block but inside of doSomething. In some languages, they actually would be different variables, because some languages have what we call block scope, meaning that anytime we have a block of code like an if block, it would define a whole new level of scope. However, in JavaScript, the var keyword has what we call functional scope. So let's take a look at what would happen if we run doSomething twice, once with a false value and once with a true value. Let's take a look at what it would do just by running through the code. In the first execution, we have var color equals blue. So color equals blue. Then we skip over the if block because doIt will be false, and we should see console.log say that color is blue. So I'm actually going to remove the second call so we can just focus on this first one. So I have it saved out. If we go to our browser and refresh, we see color after the if block is blue. And this makes sense. So let's see what happens if doIt becomes true. In this case, we are going to execute the if block. You might expect the first console.log that's inside of the if block to say that color is red. And again, you'd be correct. But you might also expect that the second one will continue to be blue, much like how shadowed variables do not affect variables at a higher level. But if we run it and we refresh, we'll see that in our second invocation, inside of the if block, it is red, and after the if block, it is red. And that's because even though we use the var keyword inside of our if block, it's still inside of the same scope as the color that's defined blue after the doSomething line. And that's because var color equals red is the exact same variable as the color that we defined blue. So the var keyword on this line here is actually completely useless. It doesn't define a new variable called color. It actually is simply referencing the same color. Now this is something that's very important to remember. In other languages that have block scope, the color inside of our if block would actually shadow the color outside of the if block. But in JavaScript, the only time we get a new level of scope is when we create a new function, and an if block is not creating a new function. Therefore, it's all the same scope, and it's all the same variable. So what if we did something like var number equals 10? A very special thing happens when we do something like this. You may think that the number is only declared when doIt is true. However, that's not actually what happens. When JavaScript sees a declaration like var number equals 10 in the middle of a function, it does something called hoisting the variable. Instead, you're not actually declaring the variable on this line in the middle of the function. What really happens behind the scenes is var number is declared at the top of the function. Then, instead of declaring it here, it actually simply assigns at that point. So this is what actually happens when you have a var initialization in the middle of a function. Its declaration is hoisted to the top of the function that you're in, and then where you set the value, it simply sets a value to that variable. So this is important to remember. Now, you don't really have to think about it so long as you follow the simple rule of keeping all of your variable definitions at the top of your functions. Anytime you see a var declaration here, it's completely unnecessary because instead you could do var number at the top and simply assign to it in the middle, which is actually what happens when the JavaScript runs. So you should always try to avoid having a var declaration anywhere but at the top of your function. Of course, global variables are a little bit different. In that case, you probably want to define all of your global variables at the top of the file they're used in. This is not only because this is how the hoisting will actually make it work, but also because it allows you to see at a glance what all of the variables you are using in this file are. So anytime you declare a variable, choose to have it declared at the top of your function. Not only will it make it more obvious what's happening in JavaScript, it'll also make your code much easier to read. Simply by looking at the top of the do something definition, we know that there are two variables in play, color and number. Of course, there's also the argument doIt, which acts as a variable itself. So you can now see the three variables that are defined inside of do something at a quick glance, instead of having to read the entire function definition. Now, one last thing is here we have multiple variables defined one after the other. In our case, we decided to do two separate var statements, var color equals blue and var number. Now, this can work, and in fact it does, but there's another way that we can define multiple variables that's a little bit cleaner and preferable to use. And that is, instead of using a semicolon after your first definition, we'll simply use a comma. Then we can do another variable definition, like number, and then have a semicolon. And this will have the exact same effect. We can have as many of these as we want. For instance, we could have name, and we can even choose to initialize variables and mix them with variables that we are not initializing. So we'll initialize name to Jim. So in this case, with one var declaration, we're defining a variable called color and initializing it to blue. We're defining a variable called number with no initial value, and we're defining a variable name with the initial value of Jim. Now, as you add more and more variables to this declaration, it may become a little bit unruly to have on one line. To fix that, you can simply split it onto multiple lines. For instance, you could do something like this. The indentation is not necessary. It's just as valid to do this. However, it's not very clear that number and name are part of the var statement. So it's common to indent either one level or sometimes two. And two levels, in my case, is 4 spaces. And since var and space is 4 spaces, it makes all of our variables line up nicely. Now, when you're doing a multi-part variable declaration, it's important to remember that all of them should be separated by commas, and the whole statement should end in a semicolon. If you, for instance, use a semicolon here, instead what we're doing is we have the var statement defining color equals blue and number. However, name equals Jim is simply a global assignment to the variable name, which can cause the problems that we talked about in an earlier video. Again, just remember that anytime you have a multi-part variable declaration, you separate them all by commas. Otherwise, you could have some unintended behavior that will cause some bugs that can be pretty hard to figure out. So now you should be very familiar with variables in JavaScript. We learned about proper naming, about how function scope works, and about shadowing and hoisting. Up next, we'll learn about the types of values variables can store.